Hi, Sean Kidney here again with another day. Today, we're really excited to be able to have a chat with the Commissioner, well, the Commissioner for everything to do with finance, really, the Commissioner for Financial Services, Financial Stability and Capital Markets Union in the European Union, Mairead McGuinness, who is a fellow Irishman like me. You may not tell from my accent, Mairead, but I actually do have an Irish passport. We're talking about Europe's incredibly important 2030 targets, 55% cut by 2030 in terms of emissions in the context of the global position, and what's Europe actually doing about it all. Can you give me a bit of a sense of how you're doing this? Because this is tough, right? This is a really hard agenda.
Well, look, first of all, thank you, Sean, for having this conversation. And can I just say that you've hit the nail on the head? This is very tough. So the European Parliament, the leaders, Commission, we are all focused on delivering on a reduction of 55% in our emissions by 2030. That is very soon. And we know that the challenge is enormous. There's a sense of urgency, I think, today coming from all of the economic sectors and from the financial system. And I suppose where I come into all of this is that the work we do is about how the financial system will put its back behind our transition towards green, sustainable and digital. And the truth is that we need vast amounts of money. Of course, there's a lot of money out there looking for a home. So in a sense, we should be able to match. But what the industry tell us, what the sectors are saying is they want clarity, they want signposts. And a lot of our work here is about providing those signposts, both in the medium and the longer term. And more, even where we have come forward with proposals on corporate reporting, the corporates say this is tough, but they say it gives them certainty. So there's several pieces to our jigsaw around this transition. None of it is easy. All of it is urgent, and yet we have to go through the legislative process. So in a nutshell, what we're doing here is saying to the financial world, play your part. Invest in what is sustainable. We're saying to the corporate world, provide the information. We also need to support SMEs in this transition. And really, this is the entire focus of our work here. One of the things that's in my title, not just financial services, but as you said, financial stability. And you know, the financial system is not removed from the real world. And there are risks to financial stability from climate inaction. So really, there is huge pressure on all of us to do and deliver on what we have actually put into law, and this reduction emissions by 55%. When I talk to different sectors, I have to say they some of them say it's impossible, some of them say it's doable, others say it's an enormous challenge. And I think we have to be both leaders and supportive of this change. And I think there's also a sense in which Europe needs to convey to our citizens and our economy that we're not doing this alone, that Europe isn't forging ahead, because the rest of the world needs to come on that journey as well.
And that's a really big part of this whole solution, isn't it? How do we, especially the major economies, China, US, Europe, and India as it starts coming on board and recovering from COVID. So what's that agenda look like going forward? We've had CBAM, which is a bit of a, you know, a flag, putting a flag up the flagpole on a negative side, but on the positive side, you're also doing stuff, aren't you?
Yeah, look, I mean, CBAM is an instrument that may be necessary in order to make sure that the work we're doing doesn't put our economy, our industries at a competitive disadvantage because we're doing the right thing by climate. Yep. But let's park that, because that's one instrument. What we're doing at the global level, and Europe is acknowledging, we account for about 8% of emissions. So if we go alone, we're not going to make the difference. We need the rest of the world to join us, and they are. There's lots of good conversations going on. Maybe to this point around urgency, we've talked a lot. I've come from the European Parliament. That's my background. I negotiated climate law. And I think at this point, we need to move beyond words into absolutely deeper action. We need to have conversations globally. So we have set up the International Platform on Sustainable Finance. And what this is doing is pulling together many of these big players you've mentioned in order that we talk globally about what and how we can all deliver. We know that the US are back in the conversation now, and we would expect that at the end of the year, which is very shortly, that we will have this COP meeting, and that there will be more, if you like, focused targets. But I actually think we need to talk about focused action. So when I talk about what we're doing, we have this concept about double materiality. So a company doesn't just look at what climate change will do to its balance sheet and profits, but equally must report on its impact on both climate and indeed biodiversity. So you have this, in my view, a quite correct double view. The rest of the world aren't fully on with this idea yet. So we don't want to pull back from our ambition. And in a sense, we do need, and we'll come to taxonomy, I'm sure, we do need a common ground taxonomy globally, because what we're doing is probably a little bit ahead of the curve, but we want to make sure that there's something for everybody to at least base their work on and their ambition on. We don't want, if you like, to pull back on the ambitions that we have, or indeed others might have, but we do need a common baseline. So wherever we have these conversations globally, there should and is a focus on this now. And I think, again, to the point that the financial industry likes to have benchmarks, likes clarity of information, and that they would be happy to see a common ground taxonomy. And I have to say that while our taxonomy is still relatively new, I'm quite encouraged when I talk to the financial sector and they are using the taxonomy. So while it actually hasn't gone through the full regulatory screening of the co-legislators, and we have to respect their work, it's interesting that the industry, the financial industry, is taking this as a really useful tool and implementing it. So in a nutshell, at the international level, we're having these conversations. We're trying to make sure that we all step forward our ambition and that Europe leads perhaps, but that we're not leading no one. We need to lead people and bring them with us, including, as was said recently at a conference, I think we need an honest, open conversation in all our societies and communities about the extent of the transition. Because sometimes, you know, even I could be guilty of it, saying, well, we all have to change, but how much am I prepared to change? Maybe COVID and the experience of the last over year and a half has shown us how suddenly change can be imposed upon you. It's not always nice, but it's amazing how we did adjust with difficulty to the awful implications of the pandemic. Maybe this was the first learning curve for us, because I think what's to come, and we've had terrible weather impacts in recent times in New York and indeed across Europe. And I do think people are beginning to get very anxious about the consequences of climate change and climate inaction. And the last point, you know, people will say we can't afford this. We're trying to recover from the pandemic. And, you know, the little bit of accounting knowledge I have, you have two sides of balance sheets and profit and loss accounts. The truth is, if you measure the cost of inaction or doing nothing, you know, that's a much more costly route to take. Nobody wants to go there. And equally, we shouldn't go there by accident. And that's something we need to be mindful of, that if we don't move beyond nice words and meaningful targets to concrete actions that work and indeed are able to revise as we go along, then I'm afraid the nice words will be quite hollow. And we'll have very angry politics, a very angry society.
That's a real challenge for us. And for our listeners, in the next session, you'll hear about the Common Ground Taxonomy proposal from Marcel Haag and Ma Jun, representing the China and the Commission counterparts with a bit more detail about it. But of course, there are some tough things for us to tackle here. And of course, around the taxonomy, which sort of represents Europe's investment pool, which is in line with the Paris Climate Change Agreement and more to the point, our 2030 targets. There are still uncertainties around the edges, transition things, for example. We've got the nuclear argument. I'm not going to go to nuclear argument, but we've got the gas argument too, and should it be or not. How are you tackling the concept of transitions and these difficult areas of debate, which are causing a lot of anxiety amongst investors in particular about what to do going forward? What's the process in a very fraught area?
I suppose the truth is all change brings with it these stresses and strains. So we can talk about all of these things, including nuclear, because I think we need to talk about these rather than shy away from them. Having said that, in the legislative process here, the difficulties around some energy forms was so severe that the co-legislators asked the Commission to try and take on board these points. So without going into detail, to some extent, taxonomy perhaps isn't the best way of talking about what we're doing. So what is it? It's actually, if you like, a book, if you probably electronic at this stage, where you can look at a sector and see very clearly what it would mean to be sustainable in the sense of climate and biodiversity. And it's really then to be used by both companies in those sectors and the financial system to make their judgments around what and how to invest. I was quite taken by the fact that we were looking at green, what was green, defining green. And if we only direct investment towards what's green today, we will not achieve the change. The change is in financing the transition.
Very good point.
Here's where it gets crazily difficult. And let's be very frank about this. There are some on gas, for example, who would hold the view that gas can never be labeled green. And this is it's a fossil fuel. So I don't argue with that point. But I do ask the question in some member states where coal predominates and there is a concern that they cannot move immediately to renewables, may need to use some gas. How do we accommodate for that? How do we allow for maintenance and maybe safety of some power plants using different renewable sources if we don't give them some sort of criteria? So there are really, as you pointed out, lots of gray areas, sometimes in the middle, not just on the edges, because this is new. We're dealing with trying to work through, I suppose, the technical details to address the natural world, which is in crisis because of the fact that human beings have used fossil fuels for forever. And we're coming to grips with it. And maybe if we had a less divisive arguments around many parts of our taxonomy, it would be easy. But the truth is, again, and including around forestry, there were some extremely important debates, particularly in some member states. So what I always try to say to those who have absolute positions on everything, in politics, absolutism doesn't work. That you do need to try and listen very carefully and accommodate the concerns of some while not conceding the core point, which is we want a more sustainable world, which includes a more sustainable economy, more sustainable production and consumption, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So despite all of those difficulties that we faced, we have on the table now a document that covers 80% of emissions, if I'm correct.
Yeah, no, it does.
I'm getting because sometimes figures escape us, but let me repeat that. If, and we hope it will go through the process of the co-legislators, this will cover 80% of emissions. Now, in my view, collectively, Europe would have had a great achievement when we get this over the line finally. And it will give that clarity to sectors and the financial system in a huge part of the economy. Then we will have to work on perhaps the more contentious issues. But nothing about this is easy. If it were, we would have done it when we were first warned. And as human beings, we have this awful capacity, and I was in the political system, so I'm part of that, where we know, but it's difficult to show leadership and bring people with us on the journey. Maybe now, because of the experience of a pandemic, of a societies that are more aware of the fragility of their way of life, that we might have more political impetus around actually doing the change, putting the words into action, but also while acknowledging that it will mean a lot of change and disruption, also talk about the opportunities, because there will be new jobs created from this transition. We will have actually a better environment, we'll have better air quality, we'll have lots of things that will be improved by this. So in one sense, it's an opportunity to reset at a higher level the way we live, work and play. But Europe alone is not enough, and I can't stress that enough to you.
Yeah,
in conversation.
the collaboration is critical. But of course, you mentioned opportunity, because for the investors, particularly all the big institutional investors that we work with, the question is, where do you put your money? We have the money, and the taxonomy, of course, is now being seen as a sandbox. That's where you put your money, because it's going to become policy supported going forward. The question is, how do we make this work of other markets? I mean, is there room for deepening capital markets engagement with the Chinas and Indias of the world, do you think?
I think the first thing is Europe needs to deepen our own capital markets. And I think we do that around the transition, the green transition, if you like. So it is an opportunity for us to push again our capital markets union. Secondly, there is a lot of money there looking for a home, some of it probably going into quite risky things. We would perhaps like to see the market and the financial sector take a more long-term view. I'm coming back to financial stability. This is a tricky area for us. So if there is a sudden, if you like, removal of capital from one sector of the economy where we wanted to go eventually away from, what are the impacts for financial stability? So as well as pushing for significant change, we also have to manage that change. And this is where, and I've listened very well, since the summer break, and it seems like months ago, but it's only a few weeks. But I've been listening to various players saying milestones and targets and a pathway rather than the cliff edge. We talk about the cliff edge in terms of the support coming to cope with COVID in the member states. Don't do cliff edge or you'll collapse everything. And in a way, we need to think the same way for how we manage the transition away from fossil fuels or sectors that are highly emitting, and do it in a way that preserves financial stability, finds an outlet for that money where it can get the return and equally fund the change. So in a way, we are I suppose, I was going to use the analogy of a ship, but I won't name it. In a sense, we're trying to turn, if you like, an enormous vessel around.
Yeah.
The water's quite shallow. There's all sorts of difficulties about doing that, but we don't have a choice. And every time people say to me, this is too much, too difficult, whether it's the construction, the agriculture, the food chain, the financial system itself, I mean, stand back and ask yourself, what choice have we? Keep going as we are? That doesn't look particularly enticing. And I think, communities, politics, society is ready for change, but I think there's a huge responsibility on anyone working in this area, in our institutions at EU level, in our governments, in our local authorities, to help manage the change, give the message as to what we're doing and why we're doing it. And it's why, for example, a week ago, I was in Austria and indeed in France, and will be in other member states, bringing the message, because all too often, maybe you see us on screen and you don't think we're real, but we are. And we mean business. And I think the most important thing is to be where communities are and talk and really indicate what we're doing, and more importantly, why we're doing it and the results we expect from the work that we do. Didn't mention Fit for 55 and all of the other massive pieces of legislation that have to be updated to comply with our wonderful targets. And these are now in legislation. So we are legally obliged to deliver.
And that's certainty for investors, for banks. People can plan on this now.
Exactly. It's also, in a way, while it gives certainty in that direction, it also adds to the enormous sense of urgency that time is short. I was going to say time is short and waiting is long, but in fact, the waiting is short as well. So I think that, the work you're doing and those who are listening and hopefully taking part in this event, we all have to work together. And we have to make sure that the pieces join up. And if there are, and this is where I think we need to be very mindful of trying to be flexible. So if there are blips along the way, that we're flexible enough to, work around difficulties that perhaps we haven't seen, and that we're alert to where there might be some vulnerability. So I think it is a time for urgency. I'm thinking of how we managed to travel in recent weeks because of the COVID certificate. A wonderful innovation, which happened because there was huge cooperation between the institutions and the member states, and it happened rapidly. We need the same type of cohesion around climate action and biodiversity, and it's coming.
It's fantastic to hear you talking about this from the point of view of climate change, because it's so important. Europe's targets are so important, and clearly there's a huge agenda. Just as a wrap up, I've got to ask you, what do you see as the next 3 big issues on your table to get over the next few months? Give us a flavour from it, especially from the investors' point of view, who are looking, hey, we want to invest, give us some clues. What do you see as the next things that you've got to tackle?
Well, I suppose the first thing is to get through the regulatory process, this first taxonomy. Secondly, that will be shortly, we hope, go through a procedure both in Parliament and Council. The second thing we have to do is honour our commitments around alternative energy, or not alternative, but energy sources that are not covered. And indeed, the agriculture sector isn't covered yet because of CAP reform. So we have to look at those sectors that are not in and try and encompass them in some form, whether it is around decarbonisation. And again, the terminology will be interesting, and it will not be an easy path. And perhaps thirdly, because you asked for 3 things, is to demystify, because I think there's a lot of language and maybe at a high level, we need to talk, ground level, and also stress the point that I've made to you, that while the costs are high, of course they are, that the costs of inaction are higher. And therefore, to me, it's a no-brainer that we've got to do this. And perhaps because I come from the political sphere, not to underestimate the challenge of bringing everyone with us. We talk about leaving no one behind, and I believe that passionately, but I have difficulty with those words, because I want to deliver on it, but I'm acutely aware of how difficult that will be. And the dangers if we don't bring everyone with us. I mean, there are people who are using coal today because they have no choice. It is the fuel they have. They may not be able to afford to pay an annual fee for heating. So what are we going to do to help them to make that journey rather than attack them for the fuel they used? And maybe what I'd like to see happen, and you didn't ask me that, is for a moderation of the language, whether you're in the political system, the NGO community, civil society, the financial system, and the economy. I think it's time for us to pull back from absolutism towards an agreed agenda where we won't get everything in place overnight, but our path is set towards progress. And if I can help in any way to bring us into that mindset, that I intend to do.
Mairead McGuinness, it's fantastic to hear you speak today. And can I say, it's fantastic to hear the agenda, about the agenda that DG FISMA, the Commission, is pursuing this area. It's what we need more of, leadership. And of course, Europe has this extraordinary position now of being the global leader, setting the benchmark for 2030 targets, other measures. Hey, we've got to deliver. But for that, we'll be supporting you and cheering you as you succeed in this task. Thanks so much for joining us today, and good luck.
Well, thank you. Bon chance. We all need that, don't we? Thank you.
We do. Thank you so much.